happy to have with us Devesh Kapur and Arvind Subramanian, both of whom need no introduction. Uh, we're here primarily to discuss their latest book, The Sixth of Humanity, which is a book on India's development Odyssey, as they call it. They've been on a book tour, and they were also in another university earlier this afternoon talking about the book, and I think earlier at PIC as well in Pune. So it's a book that's been extensively talked about, discussed, reviewed in many different forums. And thank you very much for making the time for Nayanta.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So, very briefly, was the work they've done, their life journeys, education journeys, careers. We thought this would come out in the course of this conversation. But Devesh is a Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's also been a professor at UPenn, at Harvard, and is a well-known columnist, published on a wide variety of topics, including higher education. We'll get to that topic a little later as well. And Arvind Subramanian, as many of you know, has been Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India a few years ago. Currently at the Watson Institute at Brown University. He has also had stints as an economist of the International Monetary Fund. Also had positions at Johns Hopkins and Harvard years ago. Again, very widely published in areas of economics and public policy. When I first started reading this book, the first thing that came to my mind was, I wish I had this book 20 years ago. For many years at IIT Bombay, I was teaching a course on development planning and policies in India, post-independence period. And I trained as a sociologist. I had a colleague who was an economist. The two of us used to teach this together. And we wanted to offer this as a multidisciplinary course. And we literally had to put together material from many different sources. And a lot of the information that is in this book, especially pertaining to the period 1950s to 70s, very, very difficult to access. So thank you very much for the enormous effort that I know has gone into the making of this book, because it is going to be very widely used, not just as a research reference, but as a text in areas related to development studies, particularly. One of the things that also struck me when I was reading this book is that very often we tend to be, and likely so, critical of many things that are happening or not happening in India. But the comprehensive survey that they offer from 1950 to 2020 also tells us about the enormity of the success that India has achieved in many different fields. And it's not been easy. It's been difficult, and it's something that, considering the things that we're seeing around the world today, it's something that we need to be legitimately proud of as well. At the same time, the book is very balanced. I was in particular struck by one of the tables. It talks about the mischaracterization and misdiagnosis of India's economic policies across different periods. And systematically they talk about what is a left perspective, what is a right perspective, and then using data, what is their view on the success and some failures in each phase. And from the perspective of Nayanta, where we have a very strong emphasis on interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, the book right in the beginning makes it very clear that its unique contribution is in offering a multidisciplinary perspective on India's development journey, because many of the other works have been in silos. When they talk about silos, it's not simply about disciplinary silos. They also talk about how to understand India, you need to capture the rich and complex interactions between nation, state, society, and markets. And it's important to do this because development is not just about economic growth, it's also about governance, it's about social inequalities, it's about social transformation, it's about understanding the regional differences, about understanding federalism, and so on. So this is a great example of how a real world problem, the real world can be understood using a very interdisciplinary perspective. And it's something that they achieve very comprehensively and very uniquely compared to most other books on India's development journey. So before we sort of begin to go into the book, just to get to know the two of you better, can you take us through your own college lives? What were some of these significant formative influences on you. What made you choose the subjects that you read? Because you had a diverse journey moving from engineering to public policy, and then you also had to go via management at IIM before you had economics and policy making. So just take us a little bit through your college life and journey.
Devesh,
And what are the formative influences affected your subject choices and career journeys?
well, I sort of grew up in Calcutta at a time when Bengal, which was India's most industrialized state at independence, began its steady decline, which is from the mid 60s. And we show that through in the book that no state has declined as sharply relative to where it was in the 50s as was Bengal. So in the sort of mid 70s, late 70s, 70s was probably India's worst growth decade for a variety of reasons we can talk about. So basically, as a young person, the opportunities were very limited. So you either did engineering or medicine, the usual thing. So I went to what is now known as IIT Benares. You did chemical engineering because that was your rank and that's what you got, not for any other reason. Now, at that time, engineering in IITs was a 5-year program. So BHU, he had nicknamed it Banaras like Holiday University. So what that meant was that you had enormous time to read if you were so inclined. And so I read massively outside engineering, not I had a group of friends. And so it was leisure, pleasure, or whatever you want to call it. But it was largely, later on when I teach, I use this Sanskrit phrase. My Sanskrit is poor, so I'll say it in English. It says that you learn 1/4 from your teachers, which is humbling to us, 1/4 from your own efforts, 1/4 from your peers, and 1/4 with the passage of time. Now, with the passage of time, maybe as we grow older, I think it might be negative. I think, to be fair, maximum we learned was from our peers. Teaching was modest, to put it mildly, and so on. I think having that peer group, you read a lot, but of course, at that time you did engineering, you did nothing other than engineering. And then as it happens in those years, jobs were few, so everyone was applying for the US. I got a fellowship, again doing chemical engineering, where I did material science and so on. So I worked on chip design for my master's thesis. And then one day I had gone to the student union and there was a university fair. So different public policy schools had their stalls. And I looked at them, it seemed interesting. And I just applied. And as luck could get it, I got a good offer like from Princeton and University of Chicago. I had no idea all my friends were engineers. Nobody had any idea what these programs were. But he said, Princeton, it's a brand name university. How wrong can you get? So I did that. Did something. As I was finishing, my advisor said, what are you planning to do? I had no idea. So he said, he was asked to write the official history of the World Bank. So I joined him. I went to a think tank called Brookings. And I spent 7 years writing the history of the World Bank. Now that was the most fabulous experience because the World Bank's archives had 3 million cubic feet of material. And there was, remember, no internet, all those things then. And at a very young age, I got to meet, that was, the co-author was going to be Manmohan Singh, actually. So I got to meet finance ministers, central bank governors all around the world, learning from the bullet train project in Japan to poultry farming in the Maghreb to the Latin American debt crisis. So it was the most fabulous learning experience. So as I was finishing that, a friend of mine, some of you might know him, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, so well known, and he was at Harvard. He said, "What are you planning to do?" So once again, I said I had no idea. He said, "Well, there's a job opening. Why don't you apply?" I applied. I got the job. So then I went to Harvard. So a lot of my journey has been, frankly, not. It's happenstance. Sometimes it's luck. In fact, I would say a lot of it is luck, and a willingness to take the chances. I guess. Then I was at UPenn for 12 years, where I built the Center for Advanced Study of India, and because every decade I've decided that whatever work I do, I'm going to walk away from it. So I worked in the 90s on international financial institutions. Then in the 2000s, I worked on international migration. Last decade on India. And as I was finishing this book, the World Bank has an annual, its flagship research publication. So I had this idea, I put it to them, and they asked me to be the lead academic. It just came out last month. It's on standards and development. So I'll probably do the last decade of my life looking at how technology is sort of reshaping society. And that's my journey.
Thank you so much. That is very fascinating, but it's also very important for students to know that journey, because we'll be telling them, don't plan out everything. Just this morning, you were talking to me about enjoying the joy of the journey itself of learning. Thank you so much.
Yeah. There's always a certain, speaking about my journey, whatever, at some level, it's not that interesting for all of you. There's a kind of vanity in talking about one's thing as if, something great and special, whatever. It isn't. I mean, I think that all of you will have very special journeys. Let me just say 2 or 3 things about my journey. One, I did a undergraduate from a very prestigious college in India, then did an MBA from a decent place in India. And when I was doing my MBA, I actually wanted to join the Indian Foreign Service. So I wrote the exam and I failed. Failed in the sense that I could have joined the Audit and Account Service, which is where my father was. And you say you want to be better than your father, so you say I'm not going to go back to Audit and Account. So I didn't get my first choice career. So then I got a job after my MBA, and then I, like Devesh, I got a scholarship to go to the UK, where I absolutely forgettable, mediocre PhD. I wanted then, the job that I wanted was to join there's a very prestigious program at the World Bank called the Young Professional Program, and a program at the IMF called the Economist Program. These are the creme de la creme. It's like the IAS of international financial institutions. I didn't get that job either. I wanted to join the IMF. I didn't get that job. So there were 2 failures, one after the other. And actually, I emerged from my PhD, to be honest, really not knowing very much economics. And I mean this very seriously. But then what happened was, through some chance, I got a job to work at what was then called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is today the World Trade Organization. And it was very exciting because the last major round of multilateral trade negotiations between countries was then happening at the GATT. It was called the Uruguay round. And I was thrown into this world of, 100 countries around the world. All these top people come and they actually negotiate agreements amongst themselves. And I was thrown into a negotiation which actually at that point was the most important global trade negotiation, which was determining the world's intellectual property regimes, i.e. the patent regime, the copyright regime, and so on. And it was absolutely fascinating. And like Devesh, I'm largely self-driven, very, like to learn, read, whatever. And I then, by the way, my PhD was so forgettable that I don't even think I tried to convert it into an academic paper. Actually, I did, and got rejected also. So 3 failures there. And then I joined the GATT. I was thrown into these trade negotiations. And then I wrote a paper, a kind of policy paper, which basically showed through some numbers that what the Western countries were planning for the developing country patent regimes, especially in the thing of pharmaceuticals. Essentially, what was happening then was rich countries said all the poor countries in the world should raise their protection for pharmaceuticals. That is, take for example Pune. Cipla is one of the famous companies in Pune, and Cipla became a world leader, and in fact should get a lot of credit for saving large parts of the poor world from HIV, because they produced these generic drugs at very low prices. And had India had the patent regime of Western countries, Cipla could not have produced those drugs because they would be in violation of all these things. But poorer countries, by definition, all the advanced countries were first began imitation, and then over time, once you develop R&D capability, then you say we have to protect, and you raise the protection to these. But the Western countries were trying to do it prematurely for developing countries like India, Brazil, China, and so on. So I wrote a paper saying, look, if this happens, India would lose $1 billion, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had it was a very exciting job. But what happened was that a year or 2 after I wrote this paper, I ran into a senior Indian government official who said that the American, chief trade negotiator came to India and told Mr. Chidambaram, who was then the commerce minister, look, your position on patents is wrong. You will not lose by changing patent regimes, so you must change your patent regime. Apparently, in that meeting, Chidambaram said her name was Carla Hills. She was called Carla Crowbar Hills. That is, she was opening up the doors, or opening up the trade regimes of other countries. So Chidambaram apparently told her, Madam, you're wrong. I have a paper written by an Indian which says exactly the opposite. When I heard this, it was really a moment of, for me, the moment of epiphany, because it said, wow, that even a kind of second or third rate academic like me can have policy influence. And so that was, I think, really the turning point in my life in terms of saying, this is what I want to do. I don't want to be an academic, partly because I'm not good enough to be an academic, but partly also because that, the ability to influence policy, is what. So I wanted to do rigorous research, but directed at very important policy questions. And that's my, since then, mostly that's what I've been trying to do. And when I became chief economic advisor, that's also what I was able to. The only thing I will say is that, as I said, I learned all my economics after my PhD. So sometimes I wish I had this book when I was studying economics in college, because I think that the teaching and understanding of India and the economy, I think, was not very different from what we have in the book. And so the only thing I would say is that I just read and read on my own in order to learn about economics. And, I think, so my message to you is, just be curious, read, whatever you're interested in. And then, even a second-rate academic like me can, end up writing a book, as it were.
Thank you both. I think what united both of you is an deep interest in public policy, and I don't think anyone of us believes your yarn about being a second-rate academic.
He's the most creative person that I know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not being falsely modest by saying, I mean, the truth is that we will all fail. We will all not get what we want, and several times over. It's not just once. And how we react to that is what.
I think what most important thing that came out for me was that both of you had your learnings influenced by real life experiences, right? So that is the way of learning, not just learning from the books or from classes. Right. And that's what they're trying to do here at Nayanta. Which brings me to the book itself. If you can take us through the process of writing the book, when did the idea seed? How did you decide to collaborate on this, and how did you decide that this is what they're going to focus on? This is how we're going to distribute the process of writing different chapters. What was the process of collaboration in this book?
See, I think that, and this is something that actually I haven't even told Devesh this actually. It's something that I've kind of come to realize. I think there were three things that Devesh and I really shared, which allowed us to embark on this process. First is that genuinely we thought development is not just about economic growth, or it's not just about, this whole silo business that we say is really true. Devesh, for example, has done a lot of, even before we wrote the book, a lot of excellent work, really excellent work on India's state and India's public institutions. So he's kind of a master of the Indian state. I've done work on economic growth. And we firmly believe that this development framework should have, the state, society, about which also Devesh has written a lot, state, society, markets, and nation building. So development is not, and all this done through democratic politics. I think that kind of framework, that this is what a book should address on development, is one. The second thing we shared, because it's an idea that we've been discussing for over 10 years, is this whole idea that we had about precociousness, India being a precocious democracy, doing things ahead of its time, even on economics, on politics. So that's something also we shared. And the third thing we shared was absolute obsession with and fascination for data. In his work, he's used so much creative data. When I did the economic survey, we kind of did lots of economic data. So once we shared these three things, then it was kind of easy to say, well, let's write this book and so on. And just one last one, Devesh. And actually in 2019, after I'd finished my stint as chief economic advisor, we actually wrote a 100-page kind of draft of a book, which was entirely about what India should do, entirely prescriptive. India should do this reform, that reform, that reform. We abandoned that, one. And two, in this book, we said we will not have any prescription. So that's how, that's kind of the Devesh wonder.
I think one other factor was our frustration with where academia has gone. One, as you know, an obsession with theory, and an obsession with micro studies, both of which are valid. We found that there is almost complete paucity because of the way is so much of incentives of publication are driven by the obsessions of American academia, because it is sort of hegemonic almost in some ways, right? It sets the fashion, the trends. And so we did not want to write this book to cater to those demands. We wanted to write this book that an Indian should read to understand her country. That was our thing. It was not for academics. And we wanted to write it at a big picture, not get into micro details of everything. And that, I think, is something we were very frustrated by, the lack, as you said,
exactly,
looking for a book that just isn't stuff. Because everyone has gone so micro or trying to prove some theory, which, especially what Foucault said or whatever. And, frankly, there's no theory in the book. As Arvind said, we are going to put together data on a wide range of things and then allow the data to tell the story wherever it takes us. That's sort of also.
Yeah. Well, one more thing I would add, and it's kind of like something that I would urge all of you as students also is, Devesh said that, see, Devesh is a reluctant academic and I'm an itinerant academic. I've been in and out of academia. And we do think that, knowledge and wisdom is by definition broad-based. It cannot be narrow. And that's why, as students, I would urge you always to think about, what are the big questions, not be confined by what just transpires in the classroom, and kind of look at the world out there. What are the big questions, and keep a focus on that rather than being, conforming to whatever the classroom or, academics will ask you to do.
As someone and many academics will relate to this, the process of collaboration in academia is always very thought, right? So my question is, how did you remain friends after the writing of this book?
So I think just a couple of observations is that, one is that as I said, we shared all these things. And then the next step is that what we said was, obviously we allocated, chapters or topics for one person to take the lead, with the understanding that the other person would have full freedom to, make changes, suggest changes, etc., etc. And where we disagreed, the final arbiter would be the data. Both of us believed in data, and if he says resources are important and I say no, preferences are important, then let's find the data which will allow us to adjudicate the two. And so that was, I think, and the basic trust that we had that we would, if we disagree, it's not because of reasons unrelated to the subject itself. So that basic trust we had, and we had disagreements, no question. There are disagreements on style, there are disagreements on substance, but some of I think, or I would say a large part of the book, hopefully, is better because of our disagreements.
And that's a very important lesson to learn in these times.
Absolutely. I think the point that Arvind made is any collaboration, if you don't have trust, it's just much more difficult. And trust requires, one, mutual respect. You fundamentally trust a person, say, when you write a book or an intellectual, that you respect that person's intellectual. And the differences are not about your ego, but a genuine difference based on evidence and so on. And I think we all have egos, strong egos, but you have to know when to check it. And it can't be just because I said I'm right. And the second is, you have to know how to resolve your disagreements. There will always be disagreements, but you have to know how to resolve them in an amicable way that it doesn't get personal.
The last thing I would say about the collaboration is that, we also had the benefit of, lots of help from youngsters like you. We had, at least I would say about 15, 20 youngsters who actually helped, because there was so much data to put together. And we also had friends who took a lot of interest in our work and gave us, really detailed feedback on this. So when they say, it takes a village to bring up a child, it takes at least a Hamlet to write a book of this sort. Can
we verbal and is it collaborative exercise, whether you formally collaborate with others or not, or this gives another address?
Yeah. Sorry, one more thing I would say is that, and this is something that, the other thing that we were keen on is, I do think that, because we wanted to write stuff that was rigorous, but also readable and accessible. As we say in the book, Ram Guha's book was a bit of an inspiration because, it's very deeply researched, so much archival research, again, very comprehensive, very detailed, but very accessible and readable. And that's something also we wanted to,
That's something I completely agree with. It seems a difficult read at 700 pages, but once you start reading, it actually is it's almost like a narrative, a story about India with multiple characters and story arcs. So it's a very easy read.
I know you mentioned earlier that
there's not much theory in it. And I was actually thinking of it in a very different way. There are arguments, right? And there are ideas, and you use concepts to explain some of these stories about India, especially the uniqueness of the Indian development experience. And one of the terms that struck me was this term precociousness.
Right.
And you refer to precocious democracy, but precociousness with reference to certain kinds of economic transformation, for example, the services sector. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So we use the term precocious in the sense of something that is ahead of its time. Ahead of its time in a development sense that other countries at similar levels of income did not do this. India did this way ahead of other countries at similar levels of income. So the classic example, Arvind will talk about the economic side. On the political side, we begin by looking at what was the income level at which India gave universal franchise. And we show that India is a complete outlier. Most countries in the West, gradually a franchise increases. So in the US, when it becomes independent, it's the landed white elite. You had to own land if you could vote. Then it gradually expands to all white men. Then slowly it expands after the Civil War to African Americans, and even that is not fully realized. Women get the vote only about 150 years after independence, right? India did it all at once, and at very low levels of income, very low levels of literacy. Now remember, when you vote, we don't realize what a unique challenge it was. If you're not literate, how do you know who you're voting for? When you take the ballot paper, you can't read. How do you know who you're voting for? So that's how the first, unique thinking by the Election Commission to create symbols for political parties. Whatever, the bicycle, the lantern, the charkha, etc., etc. So because symbols, parties put up the symbols, so I'm voting for that party, right? Even though I don't really know who the candidate is, because I can't read her name, right? So these were some early things, and then what our book sort of tries to look at, what were the consequences of such unusual sequencing? And that's the sense we use the term precocious.
So that's on the political side, right? So there are also kind of manifestations of precociousness on the economic side. Classic, most countries that are successful over time in development, economic development, they first have lots of people working in agriculture, and then over time, a large part of that workforce goes to manufacturing, especially formal manufacturing, and then over time, as incomes rise, manufacturing wages rise, they then shift to services. So agriculture, manufacturing, services is the typical sequence. Of course, in the Indian case, we know we've mostly gone from agriculture to services, and we've not done levels of formal manufacturing, especially low-skill manufacturing, like many of the successful Asian countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Thailand, Indonesia have done. So that's another way in which we were basically doing services well before we should have done in that sequence. The international manifestation of that is that we have exported our talent, high-skilled talent abroad, and that's why you have all these Indians heading all these companies abroad. And we didn't do enough exporting of low-skill manufacturing goods, like, textiles, apparel, clothing, footwear, toys, and recently also electronics. And because we didn't do that, we did not create jobs for tens and hundreds of millions of people. And that's why essentially the way we benefited from trade was by exporting our talent, and we did not benefit from trade by exporting low-skill manufacturing goods. And the contrast with China is striking. If you look at it, China has about 20 to 25% of the global labor force. It accounts for about 50% of global exports of low-skill manufacturing. India has similar levels of the labor force, 20, 25. It accounts for 3 to 4% of global export, low-skill exports. That tells you immediately that the precociousness, had a cost in the economic side because we didn't do enough low-skill manufacturing. And the last way in which we use precociousness, and Devesh, please join a thing, is in terms of policy choices that we made. It was very unusual and irregular compared to other countries. Just to give you 2 examples, we emphasized higher education before primary education. And even on health, we emphasize population control and disease control before sanitation, public health, etc. Devesh?
I think just to add to the last point Arvind made, I think one of the singular consequences of these unusual choices was to try and create a welfare state before laying a strong foundation of public goods. And when you think of the classic Western welfare state like in Northern Europe, first there is always strong foundation of public goods, which is primary education, public health, sanitation, water. These are classic core public goods.
And infrastructure.
And infrastructure, like, roads, footpaths, all of those things. And that's why that we show in the book was actually quite costly, like for the country.
In fact, Devesh, you should, Devesh has this really nice statistic on infrastructure. Devesh, tell them about the Ganga and Brahmaputra. Yeah.
So one always, we look at state building. So state building, a state, when we think of a state versus nation, conceptually one way, and it's not the exact way, but a rough, one is about hardware, one is about software. Nation, the idea of a nation, it's a cognitive idea. Whereas when you think of a state, we think of a physical geography. And that physical geography has to be woven together. One way, among the many ways, is you build bridges across rivers, right? You're physically connecting 2 sides of a river. So if you look at, say, Bihar, in the 80s, when it was still a single state, for 100 million people, there was one bridge across the Ganga separating North and South Bihar. If you look at the Brahmaputra, then the whole Northeast, more than 1,500 kilometers, there was one bridge, right? We simply did not invest in that infrastructure for state building. And rural India, large majority of villages were not connected by good metal roads, so they were quite isolated. And so it's only, in the, at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, beginning with you really begin to see serious investments in physical infrastructure. So you guys are too young to know just how India's roads used to be when we were your age.
Thank you. I just come back to that question about education in a couple of minutes. Since you started out by talking about precociousness in terms of democracy, so in the continuing education program that we have with corporate leaders, we've had a few discussions about democracy and, a certain section of the middle class, a certain section of industry has this impatience with democracy. The democracy can be a hindrance, an obstacle to achieve economic growth. And in your book, you look at both sides, right? You talk about how democracy is double-edged in its consequences for India's development. But you also talk about democracy and governance as necessary conditions for economic development and growth. And in the last concluding chapter, you also talk about how we should not take democracy for granted. And you used, I like this, the way in which you put it, democracy is not destination or does you that. What are your thoughts on this impatience with democracy that you see on many sessions of the book?
So I think, so if you start at the very basic thing, what do we mean by the democracy, right? So the most minimal definition is you have regulars, that power changes through elections, right? So franchise, that's the minimal. But actually, if we confine ourselves with that, then I think you have a problem. Democracy is about a sensibility. It's about thinking about compromise. How do you accommodate differences? All of these things that your political opponent is not an enemy. You are essentially on the same side, but you have differences. So it's about the ability, willingness to accommodate differences. How do you do that, right? Now, our argument in the book is that one of the singular contributions of democracy in India is that, unlike, say, the Western or the East Asian experience, where nation building was through single language, single religion, in India, democracy was the key instrument of nation building. And if you weaken that, you risk undermining the nation building project itself. And if you undermine the nation building project itself, all the economic development becomes fraught, right? And we don't realize how fragile it is. Look at other large countries. Look at our neighbor. Pakistan, it became two. Sudan split up. Ethiopia, Soviet Union split up. You see in Nigeria is perpetually in that state. So large countries face much bigger challenges of accommodating diversity, because large countries will be more diverse. And that's contribution of democracy without too much violence compared to how state and nation building occurred in the West or in China and so on. That's an enormous benefit that we actually simply do not realize. We take it for granted. However, we are absolutely also open-eyed that democracy is not a free lunch. It's, there are costs. One of the biggest costs is, look, we know the minimal definition of the democracy is you need elections. Well, elections are costly. We have more and more elections, national, state, now local. We have more frequent elections. We have more competitive elections. When you add it all up, no democracy without elections, no elections without money. And that money is one of the most powerful drivers of political corruption in the country. So that is a cost. I mean, we know there is corruption. We know it's not the only factor, but we know election financing is an important driver of that. So that's a clear cost. And, we have to face up to it. The fact that we show how much more frequent elections are means that politicians have a much shorter horizon. They're not willing to invest in things where the payoff is going to be in 5 years, because they have to win the next election, which is whatever, 2 years or 3 years.
So just to add to what Devesh said on kind of the impatience with democracy, right? I think, I would say that there are two clear ways in which democracy has exacted a cost, right? One is, all successful countries in East Asia, part of the reason for the success was they were able to do land reforms. And so the land reforms were important, in themselves, because land is such a source of power that if it's held unequally, then society is going to be determined that way. But also the land reform then boosted agricultural productivity, which was critical for the rise of manufacturing and things like that. So in India, I think, despite some early efforts at, abolishing zamindari, the land reforms basically failed because the Congress party was kind of comprised of landed interests who did not want land reform, and especially at the state level where land is a state subject. So I think our inability to do land reform early on, was, I think, a price of democracy that we paid. The other big price of democracy that we are paying, and this kind of came as a surprise to us, is what we call the Kamadhenu fiscal state, right? So, I'm a kind of macroeconomist, and so it's my job to follow these things. Until we wrote the book, we had not realized that in the last 35 years, when India has been doing very well, growing very rapidly, it has had the highest government fiscal deficit of all comparative countries. Compare it to, Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, Indonesia, whatever, China, all these countries. We've had the highest fiscal deficit. And the reason is why. Why is it that we grew so rapidly? We should have had a lot of taxes, but we didn't. It turns out that our explanation is that because India is a democracy, every group wants a claim of the state, in terms of state largesse. So if you look at our taxes, many groups are excluded from taxes. The poor, the middle class, the rich, landed agricultural farmers. And similarly, on the spending side, almost everyone is getting a subsidy, either from the central government or the state government, or even the urban local bodies. So in that sense, this very raucous democracy that we have, in some ways you could say the good thing is that, every constituency gets to say, give me something of the state, and the state responds. The upside is also the downside, where if you accommodate all these interests, you end up with a very vulnerable fiscal state. Now, the thing is that the cost, just because we have a fiscal deficit, what are the costs? The big cost that we face by having this is that the amount of the budget that goes into paying just the interest, and thus crowding out all other expenditures, whether it's defense expenditure, development expenditure, expenditure for health and education, that's been crowded out. So the interest that we pay on a debt is, again, amongst the highest amongst all these countries. So we pay a cost from democracy and precocious democracy via a weak fiscal state.
Thank you. I have one common question to do of you, which is partly relevant for Nayanta, higher education, which goes back to what you were saying earlier. And the other question which I will ask usually to both you, and then we can move to the audience questions. You have a very interesting section on the software of human capabilities, where you look at education and healthcare primarily. And Devesh, you mentioned your work with Nayanta on higher education, among other things. And you worked at Ashoka, one of the new age private universities. And what do you think should be the role of higher education in the years to come for a country which is at a particular stage of economic growth and development? And in particular, a university like Nayanta, which has just started, what are your expectations from a university like this?
So one is, for its level of development, India has vastly overspent on higher education. Meaning, if you look at India's gross enrollment ratio in higher education, it is substantially higher than when other developed countries were at similar levels of per capita income. Even China achieved this level of gross enrollment ratio when its per capita income was more than double India's. What we have done, in some other work, So in the last quarter century, basically after 2000, we opened about 4 new colleges every day, including weekends, over the past 25 years. Now just think of the scale of this, right? Every day opening 4 colleges, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And you can imagine what is the quality. Now we know that a large number of these colleges are owned and run by politicians. They are of mediocre quality, to put it mildly. Who the faculty is, hardly anyone knows. What the students are learning, we hardly know. However, there is a parallel positive trend as well, which is that there is a range of good private universities with vision, with some philanthropy. This university is a very good example of that. But, we've been, whether it's sort of Geetham or here at Symbiosis or Akamrita or Christ University, every cities now have 1, 2. I'm not saying they're Harvard, etc. But why should we think of that? When the US had a per capita income of what India has, which is about 1880, what was Harvard? It was hardly anything, right? So we should also have that. So I think at least my main worry is how the political class has systematically destroyed public universities. Bombay University, Delhi University, public universities, a healthy higher education ecosystem for a country of India's size needs a healthy mix. Good public universities, good private universities, some focusing on STEM, some focusing, on different areas. So I think, and however, interestingly, what we found was this deeper problem of public university. Everything is around exams, passing exam. If you go back 100 years ago, this problem was identified. 100 years ago, when India's literacy rate was in single digits, India had more college graduates than France or Japan, which were way more developed. Why? And the report points out everything in higher education was being driven by one singular goal: getting a government job, right? And for a government job, you require a college degree. Today, if we say that for Class C, which is the vast majority of government jobs, you don't require a college degree, you require a skill, however you define. You see that the demand for higher education at mediocre college, everyone just wants the chap of the degree, the stamp, so that they can take the exam and get a government job.
So can you just, your question was, what do you expect from Nayanta, right? And I think I'm just reformulating what Devesh said. I think 2 things. I think one is we need both public and private. So kind of let 100 flowers bloom. And I think we need all kinds of, experimentation, etc. And therefore, we need hundreds and thousands of Nayantas all over the place. The second thing is that, I went to make it a bit personal, but I think it's true generally, is that education has all become about higher education, signaling, jobs, etc., right? I went to, let me be St. Stephen's College, and I am Ahmedabad. And to be absolutely honest, how much did I learn from the education, the syllabus, etc., was, I wouldn't say it's zero, but it was fairly small, right? So I think when I say 100 flowers bloom, we also need those 100 flowers where we actually turn, colleges and universities into genuine sites of learning, and curiosity and things, rather than just, entrance exam, you do this rote and you get out. So getting that, 100 flowers blooming in terms of pedagogy, syllabus, the classroom experience, and getting away from the kind of single-minded, whatever we've done on education, that would also be another thing.
I think just to add, and this is because I'm not as versed about what Nayanta is doing, so this comes out of ignorance rather than knowledge. Given the large numbers of universities, more than 1,000, question is, how do you product differentiate, right? Recreating what is already there, it doesn't seem, then you're just saying, well, we have better faculty or whatever. But whether it is that our approach to pedagogy is the distinctive. We are so large a country, there will always be 2,000 students who will come because that's what attracts them. And so there's a self-selection. You say, we're going to do X. We don't want people who want to just pass exams and look for a job. Let's say, I'm not saying that's what you should do, but let's say that's the thing. Then there are always students who are looking like for that and they don't want to go. The other thing, I happened to meet once a senior person in this government on higher education. And when I went to his office, there was a calendar, and the calendar had Ramanujan's picture. So I went to him and said, everyone knows Ramanujan, India's greatest mathematician, etc., etc. But can I just tell you, your government's policies would have meant that today Ramanujan would not get admitted to any college. Because brilliant minds like Ramanujan would fail in many subjects in high school. They couldn't care about Tamil or Hindi or, they are single-minded on mathematics, right? Suppose you get a student, she's a great violinist. Why should it matter that she has to get, 40% in language? So to me, we, as someone said, we polish the stones and dim the diamonds, right? There are, in a large population ours, there are lots of uncut diamonds who have a passion for only one thing. Why not nurture it?
So there's another variation on that. The poet, the Nobel poet William Butler Yeats, his definition of education was, it's not about filling a bucket, but lighting a fire. Our Indian system doesn't do that very well.
It wants to fill the bucket.
It wants to fill the bucket, knowledge, whatever you need for the exam. So, we need all you students to, be curious, thinking, valuing learning for learning's sake. I'm not saying you shouldn't look for a job. You should try and get the best job possible. But along with that, or at least in a portfolio of educational institutions, there should be some, at least some that cater to, learning for learning's sake and so on.
So in the interest of time, I think I'll skip some of the other questions because they've partly been answered in response to the other discussion. But there's just one other thing that I wanted to ask individually to each of you. The book dwells quite a bit on issues of inequality of different kinds, including gender, caste, religion, communalism, and so on. And you, Devesh, I know, have written this excellent book on Dalit entrepreneurs in India. And Farhad is sitting there somewhere listening to us, and he did a project with the CII on affirmative action in the member bodies of the CII, addressing, making sure that they take caste quite seriously. So this relationship between economic growth and social transformation is not something that has been studied a lot in India, especially the role of entrepreneurship.
Right.
Would you like to just very briefly respond to that on why you think it's very important look at entrepreneurship as a way of equalizing psyche?
And I have to first acknowledge that I've been very influenced in thinking about this by my two Dalit colleagues who I worked with, Chandraban Prasad and D. Sham Babu. They were my teachers and they opened a world that I was quite ignorant about. I think, and I'll come to where I think India Inc., big business, really doesn't address some of these issues, is that for a long time, starting from independence, we believed that the best way to help social groups that have been historically marginalized was through affirmative action, right? Which is education and reservations, government jobs, educational institutions, and in representation in politics. Now, it's very clear that, and we show in the book how that increased over time, but has plateaued simply because they just aren't government jobs, right? The likelihood that a Dalit youth, she would get a government job is less than 1%. How do you think we should empower the other 99%? But the focus is so, even now, government jobs, even though, and these young people spend years taking the exam, trying again. These are the best years of their lives, and they're not learning any skill because we know what it takes to prep for these things. The idea is continue with that, but add more options, right? You need a much wider portfolio of options to empower marginalized groups, one of which is entrepreneurship. So as we all know, there is no magic bullet for such hard, difficult problems. You have to try 10 things, you hope 3 work well, 2 okay, and 5 may not, right? That's the spirit in which I think one of the things we try, we helped create a Dalit Chamber of Commerce. It didn't work out. But that if the larger firms helped not in hiring as employees, but Dalit entrepreneurs in their supply chains, and then help them, bring them in the quality control, their engineers to help upgrade them. Because Sundarban had a very nice phrase for, the motto for the Dalit Chamber of Commerce, where he said, we are not job takers, we are job givers. That's a huge form of empowerment. When you are the one providing jobs, you're not the one looking for jobs, right? That sense of empowerment. And that's the spirit in which we...
Thank you. Arvind, my question to you was about data, and you referred to that, how you looked at a lot of data in the book. And we know that in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of concern about the availability of good quality data. I know there's census, pollution, employment, NFHS, the GDP on which you've written as well. So 10 years from now, somebody were to write a book like this, or you are interested in policy making and analysis, what do you think are going to be the challenges in terms of good quality data?
See, a few things. One thing, of course, is that most of the book is based on historical data. And, at a time when, I think the data were quite good. And, so we were safe on that ground. And also, I think, we devoted an extraordinary amount of time in checking and cross-checking and triangulating, if we got it from one source, try and corroborate it from another source. So that's something that we did very carefully. Now, it's true that in the last few years, things have, we used to be, Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize winner, used to say that we were the gold standard in terms of sample surveys, and we were, and it's a pity that, and by the way, the atrophying that's happened is not all politics. A lot of it is just part of the general decline in state capacity and statistics. And we know statistics in the government. In maybe whatever something's very important, statistics is towards the bottom end of the poll, so it's going to get neglected. Point number 3 is that this phenomenon of deteriorating data quality is actually more global than you would think. I think if all of you should go, and I wish I could tell you exactly the source. The Financial Times about a year ago had a graph on China, which showed how many indicators China was publishing. and it goes like this, like this, like this, and around 2010 or 12, basically after she did, no, it's not flat, it starts coming down. It dramatically comes down. Look at the US today, the kind of gold standard of everything. The employment number, the inflation number, the GDP number are, in some cases they're not going to be produced on a monthly basis. So I think, and this is something that's afflicting India as well. So in one of the chapters, I think the chapter that you mentioned, the growth chapter, is something that we actually explicitly, when we talk about the phases of growth, we do say that in the fourth phase, it's much more difficult to get a sense because the data are contested, and so I think we do, acknowledge that there have been some issues there. I think going forward, it's kind of mildly encouraging that at least on the GDP data, I think the government is trying to, putting in a lot of effort to revise and upgrade data quality, use multiple sources of information, so on. But of course, the big lacuna is the census. Census hasn't been done, and unless hopefully we will address that. But I think that my own view, and maybe Devesh doesn't share this, is that if broader politics is going to be illiberal, majoritarian, centralizing, I think data quality will be a casualty of that. So, but the good news is that there's so much more data coming from non-government sources these days that I think it's now the job not just of the government, but private sector, civil society, etc., to take advantage of this as a way not just of berating the government or thing, but producing independent, which then everyone will take seriously, and then ultimately the government will also have to respond. So I think this is what I think all the kind of the thoughts that come to mind on data as well.
But if I can add, I think one of the things when we think of official data, we naturally think of central government, census, a fair bit of government data on like agriculture, the mortality, births and deaths, all comes from states. We forget that many states have severely underinvested in statistical capacity, and that is something that is also making things. So if you see the national crime statistics, right?
It's a compilation from us.
It's all from the states, and therefore to blame the central government solely, I think would not be.
Yeah. So can I want to give an example, which in some ways, what Devesh says is absolutely right. In fact, we say in the book that on a lot of things that the sector does badly, the states do much worse. But let me give you a small hopeful sign, is that just as states generally don't do well, because in India we have many states, some states can say, look, we're going to do it better. I don't want to name names, but recently, for example, I'm working with a state where they're also upgrading their GDP and so on, say GDP, and they are recognizing that in the past they have overstated GDP growth at the level of the states, and so I think therefore the beauty about India therefore is that many states, much more experimentation is possible, and there can always be some good examples which then other states can emulate, and some checks on the system can arise as a result of that.
In fact, this is an area which a lot of students can get in, because I know students, I know private companies who are using machine learning, data mining,
Right.
to use different kinds of sources to get data. A lot of online source was not available. It's an area in which we can expand without even the support of the state. And we'll now open it up to the members of the audience, and we will take a couple of questions from the people here, and then a couple of questions.
So my name is Akshita, and good afternoon. So my question is related to something you said pretty earlier. So you mentioned that India has skipped steps when it comes to like moving from agriculture to directly to services. And then you also mentioned how India did not create a base of public goods, and before that, with introduced policies which costed a lot. So, what do you think is the reasons behind this happening in India? Is it like the democracy? Is it like the politics, like elections related, that each politician has their own agenda when they're coming? So, what are some of the reasons behind this?
Good morning, good afternoon, sorry. My name is Neera. I had a question for both of you. Deputy apply upon both of your thing. You spoke about the caste system, but Dalits were there getting jobs after and so on. This question may seem a little vague, but I want your general opinion from both of you. What do you think about the current reservation system in India?
Hello, I'm Parthasarathy. I had a question regarding one of the things Devesh sir mentioned, especially regarding a shift from prescriptive to non-prescriptive writing. You talked about a 100-page document that you had drafted, and what caused that shift to non-prescriptive writing, especially in terms of statistics or experiences. I think it's quite related to the question asked before this, but I feel like it could give us ideas as well, because we are also working on some of the ways that we write and research as well.
So, when we think of some of the factors why public goods have been under-provided, one of the factors we highlight in the book is, take Pune, right? I think most Indian cities are quite poorly run. That is simply a manifest reality. Now, one reason is, of course, that city governments have very little autonomy, have very limited resources, both financial and human. Now, why is that the case? We show that we look at government employment in the three largest countries in the world: China, India, and the United States. Now, China and the United States are completely different political systems, but they are very similar, that most government employees are either at the federal level or at the local level. India is exactly the opposite. Most government employees are at the state level. And it is the unwillingness of the states to decentralize, especially to urban local bodies. We know that we passed the 73rd, 74th amendments in the early 90s, but we know the 74th amendment, basically states have found countless ways to sabotage it. So we believe that unless there is much greater, that public employees are at the local level, greater tax resources are at the local level, it is much harder to provide, because most of your daily, of the public goods we're talking about, is the traffic light working? Is there a policeman, do you have a proper footpath? Are there holes, potholes in the road? Is the garbage being removed? Do you get 24/7 water? All of these are local public goods. And these are where India's failures of public goods is most evident. And these are all locally provided, but in India they are controlled, relatively speaking, to a much greater extent by states. The reservation thing, I think,
Just answer.
what we say in the book is that, look, the need for it, given India's historical legacy on how these groups were so severely marginalized, there was a very strong obligation to undertake that. Our point is that then became, when we think of empowerment, it became almost the only instrument of empowerment. It got unusual focus, and gradually more and more groups claimed they too were backward, they wanted reservations, and they get divided into smaller and smaller subgroups. But fundamentally, they won't solve the problem. They just aren't government jobs. So I can give 200% reservations, but if 99% of the people will not get government jobs, what exactly is the larger group going to get? So our point is not don't do reservations. Our point is you have to look beyond reservations. That's one instrument of empowerment. But like Dalit entrepreneurship, you need multiple more tools of empowerment.
So, coming for the first question, I think also one of the public goods, of course, is the neglect of primary education. Why did that happen, right? And there's a very famous book by an MIT scholar called Myron Wiener. He wrote this book called The Child and the State in India, and essentially saying that it were a very hierarchical society where the upper caste elites, had no interest in spreading education, and for a long time, that explains why we didn't. So I think Indian society is deeply implicated in some of the choices made on public goods was his major point. And of course, we know subsequently, like when the state started investing in education, it was because India's elites were shamed. There was a big conference in Thailand where they showed that India had the most number of illiterate people, and that shamed Indian elites, and that's when we started getting programs like Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan and so on. Now, corroborating that, of course, is that the two major cases where this elite thing was overcome was through reform movements from below. In Kerala and Tamil Nadu, for example, we had these, reform movements from the, lower castes, and that led to better, education outcomes as well. So we show, for example, in the book in 1966, when generally education was neglected in India, Tamil Nadu and Kerala spent the most on primary education, even though then they were not the richest states, they were kind of middling states, but they spent the most on education. So the whole Indian society is kind of implicated, and where you've had reform movements, they've been much better that way. On the question on the prescriptive, because I said that, I think that certainly when we ended up writing the book, two or three things we felt, right? If you look back on Indian development, the major changes have happened as a result of crises, as a result of technology. So, when we changed our whole economic system, it happened in 91 because of the financial crisis. Similarly, we got in technology under the Green Revolution because we had a major crisis in 1966. The other thing was technology, when the telecom revolution happened because of technology. But the other thing we show in the book is that one of the other bigger sources of change was economic growth itself. Why did education outcomes improve in India? Some of it was reform movements, but when growth took off in 1980, the demand for education increased on the part of the parents. Parents said, earlier, you get an education, you don't get a job, it's not very valuable. But if, the economy is booming, then the returns to education go up. So parents want education. And what was happening is that if they were not getting it from the public sector, they were getting it from private tuition and so on. So what we realized looking over this is that most change happens because of factors that are basically exogenous, and so it's not very easy to say do this, that, the other. Second thing is that what needs to be done, the prescription, is actually well known. We know India has to improve its education. We know we must get out of subsidies. We know that we must eliminate corruption. We know governance has to be improved. So what needs to be done is not, so if Devesh and I, after writing 750 pages, have 30 pages on, do this, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, they're mostly well known. And what do we add to the debate, right? So what we end up saying, therefore, the only prescriptive thing we say at the end is, we've had a lot of achievements which Devesh spelled out: nation building, democracy. Please do no harm. The motto is do no harm. The good things that we've built up, don't undermine them. And one of the big things there, which, because I was involved in the GST, is anything that India needs to do going forward must be done between the center and the states. We end our final book talking about the air pollution problem in Delhi. It's one case where you need the cooperation of the center, all the states. And if there isn't that basic trust between the center and the states, which is increasingly happening, then no matter what the challenges going forward, we will not be able to meet them. So do no harm is the most prescription that we do in the book.
Thank you. We'll go to those online where we take a couple of questions.
So, yes, first of all, Arvind, Devesh, thank you being at Nayanta. I'm very sorry I'm not there as well when you are, and I hope you come back sometime when I am. I also start with a comment. I haven't yet read the book, and I have to blame you both for that, because the scale of the book is such that I can't read it when I'm traveling, because I have to carry it. It's lucky it doesn't lend itself to that, and I don't read it online. But I hope to soon. My niece Rhea sent me some comments from the floor. She has read me there, and one of the comments that I think is very interesting is that it then relates to what you said earlier about looking at India on a state lens instead of just from a union government. And you make a comment which is, I think, very instructive, that the total the country has been growing in China at rates that China achieved. I guess the question I have is that why we know that if you go to South India, you go to cities in Kerala, you go to cities in Tamil Nadu, Bangalore, they feel definitely significantly more affluent than cities in the north, but they don't feel like cities in China. They don't have the feel of being in a developed city. So even if the rate of economic progress is similar for a long period of time, as you point out, why do the cities not seem to reflect that?
Let me just say one thing, and then I'll ask Devesh too, because Devesh knows more about cities than I do. Just one clarification there, Naushad, is that you see, the statement is, or the finding is, that rates of growth from 1980 onwards in 1/3 of India was comparable to China, right? But that's not a level comparison, because we start the clock in 1980. In 1980, China's already per capita GDP, etc., are twice India's, at least twice India's. So when you say I want to compare cities today, China and India, there's obviously going to be a level difference, because still the standard of living, absolute standard of living, is not the same even in the southern states as it is in China. So I think it's a small technical point, but it's an important point. We're comparing growth, not levels, in this comparison. The point is that, but it's still noteworthy that you can get dynamism of the type that China achieved. So the lesson is, of course, that if these Indian cities grow for longer and reach Chinese standards of living, then I think we should do the kind of comparison that you're doing. But the second point I'll say is that the fact that growth rates are comparable, doesn't mean, of course, that public investment, public infrastructure are going to be similarly provided. And for the reasons that Devesh said, that remember in China, the third tier is highly empowered, highly resourced, highly, agency has been given to them.
Autonomy.
Exactly, autonomy. So the Indian third tier, which provides many of these public goods and services and urbanization, they don't have the agency comparable, they don't have the resources, and frankly, and the point is what Devesh was implying, is that often they're stymied by the state governments.
Thank you, Hopkins. Anyone else online? Bamali, I can see.
Well, first again, I think as Naushad said, Arvind Devesh, delighted to have had you there. I mean, how should I say, set of people and thinkers than yourself. I must admit, I've not read the book, but I was just quickly glancing through the net to find some comments made by different people. But just is there a connect as we look at our development going further ahead between the rate of growth and income equality or inequalities? Meaning, are these two things independent of each other, or is that something that we would need to prioritize, and do these two things move and contrary to each other? Any thoughts on that? I must admit again, I'm not an economist by any yardstick, so please forgive my ignorance.
Should we try and then? Go ahead.
So, in the past, there was this whole thing, in the literature on economic development called the Kuznets curve, that with growth, economic inequality increases and then it declines. However, we find that from the 90s, broadly speaking, economic inequality has increased worldwide as a general thing, and very likely in India, almost certainly in India. And it all depends, how much depends whether you're talking of consumption inequality, income inequality, or wealth inequality. Now, one of the things, especially going forward, is the composition of growth. If your growth is skill intensive, then the factors that will get the fruits of growth will be people with high human capital, which by definition will be only the top, the decile or so. If you have labor-intensive manufacturing growth or agro-industry or things like tourism, which are much more labor-intensive sectors, then the fruits of growth will be more broadly shared. So a big thing that I think we need to think of, and that is why, Arvind in his own work and in the book has been emphasizing why labor-intensive manufacturing is so important, is not just because it will be a key driver in taking advantage of India's sort of endowments, which is large pool of low-skilled workers, but it's very important way of trying to reduce or mitigating income inequality. But Arvind will have more to say.
No, I agree everything with Devesh said. Just two points. One is that I think we should be very careful that in India, other axes of inequality matter as much as income consumption inequality. Whether it's across caste, and that's why all these questions have come up on caste, whether on gender, which we talk about in that book,
and also now on religion.
Religion. By the way, this is just one of the findings in the book that hasn't gotten enough attention, is that when we compare, we do some analysis of how many social and human development outcomes have changed across groups in India. What we find as a pattern, not every indicator, but broad pattern, is the groups that have converged, or the group that has converged the most towards the upper caste are the OBCs. The groups that have converged, not as much, but to some extent, are the scheduled castes. The two groups that have not converged at all are the scheduled tribes in
Central India.
Central India, and Muslims. So in some ways, the biggest inequalities happen there. So this kind of inequality matters, gender inequality matters. So I think what I'm saying, therefore, is in the West, there's a lot of emphasis on income inequality, consumption inequality. But in India, we also should monitor and care about and respond to other forms of inequality. The second thing, a short point, is that when we think about inequality, the way now economists think about it is that what is the inequality which is called that the market creates, and that's called pre-distribution, and then what are the state actions that makes post-market inequality less or more. And on that latter thing, the broad finding from Europe is that the more the state spends on health, education, etc., that has a big impact on reducing post-market inequality. So that's why all these things that Devesh has emphasized in his previous work, that we need to build state capacity for effective delivery of all these public goods is going to be very important.
Thank you so much. We are completely out of time, but maybe one question, because nobody has asked from the back. Any of the students at the back? No. Devesh, with you? Go ahead.
My name is Nityam, and my question was that, as you said, India skipped from agriculture to service, and as a result, a lot of our manufacturing work is outsourced. And at least among the biggest people of our market, it is well known that investing into research and innovation of such manufacturing units will help us in the long run in the independent. So my question was that even for companies who are focusing on maximizing profits, why is it switching from just demand and supply to R&D so overlooked? Why there is such a big hesitation in that?
R&D. This is a question that actually either Naushad or Devesh should answer, because they know more about R&D than I do. But of course, Naushad knows the most about R&D. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should outsource this to Naushad, because I know he's been thinking and writing about this. But one of the interesting things when you look at, so there are two things. One is the level of spending on R&D, and then who spends it. One of the interesting things is, of course, India spends relatively less on R&D. And you could argue, and people will differ, that at its level of development, it's more important to absorb existing technologies, because so many firms are so below the production possibility frontier. However, what is interesting is, compared to other comparable countries, China, US, Israel, Europe, all these countries, the Indian private sector so if you look at R&D spending, the share of the private sector, the share of government, and the share of universities. In India, the government share is much higher, is the majority, private sector is a minority. Every other country, it's the opposite. And so why the private sector cares so little about spending on R&D and innovation, whether it gets rents, therefore it doesn't, whether, especially if you look at the largest companies like Ambani or Adani, compare their R&D or patents with Samsung or their counterparts in Korea, it's a pittance. And you could argue because they have other ways to make profit, so they don't believe in spending on innovation.
So can I just maybe a slightly related or unrelated point? I think I don't know how many of you, Naushad, do you read this guy called Dan Wang? He has a book called Breakneck. Yeah. He has a new book called Breakneck, and he writes this annual letter which has just come out, which is absolutely brilliant, and where he talks about China and the US and so on. And I think there's a phrase that he uses that's kind of completely stuck in my head, which I want to find for you. This is, he says, this is China's real strength. The industrial ecosystems pulsating with process knowledge. That is, so I don't know whether this is R&D or not, but the ability, the Chinese thing has been, why have they been able to scale everything successfully? He says, in fact, when he reads that, he says, this distinction between innovation and, whatever adaptation is actually a bit overdone, because he says every Chinese worker on the factory floor is innovating. And that's what creates this, this thing of what he calls the, what's it called? The process knowledge.
So if I can add, that's one of the things we did this, so the World, So the World Bank has an annual flagship publication called the World Development Report, and I was the lead academic for this year's. It's on standards and development. And you really see how standards and an incredible focus on that, not just in China, but earlier Taiwan and Korea, was absolutely essential to building this process knowledge. Because the process of establishing and adhering to standards requires strong adherence to a range of processes. And that's something we found that, broadly speaking, there's a desultory, fairly weak attention to standards in the Indian manufacturing sort of ecosystem.
Yeah. So, I'm going to slightly deviate from script here. So I'm not going to ask the Nayanta question, because there's a thing called a Nayanta question, which is about your reading habits and what you're currently reading. And it's very silly to ask you both this question when we have references in that book.
For Arvind, you should really ask the question part before. For Arvind is one of the world's great readers.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask it in a different way. So I'm going to ask it in a different way. There's a time when social media reading plays an enormous role, and lots of people are using ChatGPT or intelligence to read. So how do you sustain reading habits in current times? And from that perspective, going back to what Nashal is saying, how do you individually keep track of? Because to write a book like this, it's not just, you don't just read a book, don't just look up some references, right? You need sustained reading. How do you manage to sustain reading habits over a long period of time, especially for students, faculty, staff who are interested in sustaining learning?
There is no doubt that social media has, even in my case, not only changed my reading habits, but has reduced the amount of, the old, reading books, etc. that I do. I do much less than I used to. So social media has taken a toll even of my thing. However, the compensation is that, if you use social media well, I think, which the only social media I use is Twitter, I'm still surprised by how much you learn and can pick up, provided you do it the right way. You have to follow the right people. You have to, have some balance in terms of, what rabbit holes you want to go down, and what you want to avoid. But I do think that, reading habits are going to change. All of you are going to be reading much less than we used to, because I'm myself reading much less than I used to. But I do think that, please use social media in a way that there's some kind of balance, and that you use it in itself, but also that leads you to stuff of the more kind of, long reading variety, long form reading, which I think you should all continue. You'll do it much less, but you shouldn't abandon it altogether, because I think now we just need to, this is a process of where we are recalibrating between long form reading and this reading. And I would say, choose people to follow. I mean, there's still, I still every day read Paul Krugman, read various people where I get a lot of knowledge from. So it's a matter of being disciplined. It's a matter of being judicious, and it's also a matter of not going down completely the social media rabbit hole.
In my case, it's being the dinosaur. I'm on no social media. I have one email account, and that is the entire electronic existence.
But he benefits from me sending articles to him.
Exactly. So my students and friends, if they spot something, they'll send it to me. So cultivate good peers and friends. But I read pretty widely. I'll read about 7-8 newspapers every day. 4 in India and 4 international, where, whether it's something on Latin America, Africa, I don't want someone to curate things for me. And you pick up a lot of what's happening in the world like from that. And then as long as you have a friend like Arvind, you're well informed. So.
Can I supplement the part?
Yeah, please.
Just for the audience, 3 books with every undergraduate.
I can say 1. You can say 2 because you read more.
Say what?
So I don't think he meant it across the curve.
I thought it was 3 plus 3, but
When we take a shortcut, yeah. For me, the single biggest was War and Peace.
See, now you're making me go down a rabbit hole. But the advice I would give, one more piece of advice I would give is the following. There's a very famous cricket book which has the line, what do we know of cricket who only cricket know? So my advice to you, without giving specific books, is that if you're doing economics, read economics non-fiction, and for everyone, you must read some fiction always. I think this is so he's given War and Peace. My recommendation for the greatest novel ever written is by a woman. It's Middlemarch by George Eliot, and that would be my recommendation for non-fiction.
Thank you.
For fiction.
If you read the book, you will know why War and Peace was mentioned. Yeah. So, I've been getting these nudges for the last 15-20 minutes about tea. They're both desperate. So, thank you very much. This was a fascinating conversation. I think we achieved much more than we anticipated in this hour past.